All right. Hey, thanks for tuning in on today's live stream. Sorry, my brain's not working right today. I'm going to be doing an AMA today. So AMA is Ask Me Anything, but in this case, since my name's Matt, it's Ask Matt Anything. Never done one of these before, but I've been asked random questions on various streams. So I wanted to give it a shot and take some viewer questions and give them some answers. So last night I actually spent some time working on a little tool based off Jeff Geerling's OBS task overlay. So in the bottom part where there's the gray screen and white bar, the questions will actually pop up there. So I'm gonna let's see if this actually works. So let's see, curl and start. All right, so the first question we've got is about using, need to make sure I can actually see the question on my own screen. Get submodules or composer packages for sub themes. So this is going to be related to a Drupal question, but I guess it could really be referenced to any kind of project. Just you have other packages and do you use a submodule to develop them separately, or do you have it as a composer package you pull in? In the case of like sub themes, usually the sub theme is always built per site. I try to avoid the whole, there's like a root theme and then a sub theme and then we sub theme the sub theme. Just because having the layers of sub themes doesn't actually help, or it stays out of date. I was at an agency before and built this. We had our own install profile and we had like our own base theme that every single client had. But then when you build a client site, that theme that they have is like a fork and forget. It might have that your parent theme, but it was built on a snapshot in time. So if you improve your base theme, you're going to break all of your other themes as well. So I have over time just found it to be too hard to leverage sub themes and instead just do like starter kits where you have like your starter kit theme that keeps growing and you do a fork of it that is forgotten and then just grows with that client site and just moves on its own. But this is pretty relevant when using custom modules or reusable packages, especially if you use GitLab. GitLab makes it pretty easy to run your own basically packages endpoint using their groups. So you could have custom modules that are used or custom scaffolding commands that you pull in. And in that case, I would use composer packages. I like to avoid submodules just because you're adding more Git information and that has to be deployed. Whereas if you just use composer packages, and this is the same for NPM, you can do this with NPM too. You point to a custom endpoint and those packages can be pulled in as well. I don't have a lot of details on how you would do that, but just go on a search engine and type it up and you can find that out there. That's how I manage it. I avoid Git submodules. I'm going to take the chat question first. So how did you learn Drupal? And that's actually a really good question. And so I first started doing Drupal in either 2012 or 2013. So I'm coming up on about 8 or 9 years, if I do math right. How I found it is the first time I experienced Drupal was around Drupal 3. I was in high school maybe, and I saw the word taxonomy, and I said, I don't need this joke. I just want to have a category. So I didn't know what taxonomy meant. So I didn't touch Drupal until about midway through the Drupal 7 lifecycle, back around 2012 or 2013. I was at a local marketing agency and we had an e-commerce site show. We're doing WordPress for everything mostly because those are just really basic sites. Then we had an e-commerce project fall on our lap. And I went on the internet, first tried to do, this is before WooCommerce became big. So there's like WP Cart, WP Cart Engine, all these other things, and they all were horrible. And you had to pay money for them. You had to pay like $100 to download it, try it, and find out it was garbage. I ended up going around searching and I found Commerce Kickstart, which if you're not familiar with Commerce Kickstart was a Drupal commerce distribution built by commerce guys. And I used that and I kind of fell in love with Drupal at that point. And so we built the site and one thing about Drupal is it's not exactly intuitive. You kind of learn through pain. Um, it sounds worse than it is, but you learn through trial and error is a better way to put it. Where WordPress, you can kind of just do things and take stuff off the shelf. Where with Drupal, I feel like you have to really explore and learn. And I learned Drupal by going through the IRC channels. I would go into, which now we have Drupal Slack, and a lot of folks were just nice and helped me out. So that's why I learned. I just learned by tinkering and doing. That's one way that I learn. I am not good at watching videos. It's funny, I do these live streams and I try to create videos, but I do not have the patience or ability to sit and watch a video, nor do I for books. Because I'm a very tinkery person when it comes to this kind of stuff. So which is one reason I liked Drupal, is it was like, hey, there's a commerce package and I can modify it or do things and see what happens. So a lot of experimenting. I do believe that there was one YouTube channel that I would watch, and I don't believe this individual is doing anything anymore. I'm going to try to open up my YouTube subscriptions, which you can't see on my screen. I'm not sharing my screen today. Maybe if there's something cool, I'll show it up. But if I can figure out how you find your subscriptions, like where's just the account? How do you find out what channels you subscribe to? Oh, here we go. Show 43 more. Hopefully it's from oldest to newest. Jaworski. It's now called Web Development Tutorials. His last thing was posted 2 years ago. And 8 years ago is when they were all posted. I'll share the name in the chat. Jaworsk1. Back in the day, he had tons of Drupal 7 tutorials, especially around views. So his tutorials around views is what taught me views, because I've forever been a horrible Drupal user when it comes to views. I don't know how people do things in views. I don't like using views. I try to avoid it at all costs. But I just learned Drupal by tinkering, basically just by, also being fortunate enough to have projects that had really, really hard problems, which caused me to tear it apart. So if you are a developer and you don't have Xdebug, set up Xdebug, use DDev, use Lando, use whatever local environment gets Xdebug, and just start putting breakpoints in places and see how it works. Like, tear it apart. Get creative, be curious. So I know not everybody uses Xdebug. A lot of people do, like in Drupal land, DPM or printr, like regular PHP, but just get Xdebug and just see how the internals work. That's one thing that I would recommend doing, or just whenever you hit a really hard problem, that's how you learn. It's mostly experience, just by having been exposed to a lot of very hard problems that I've had to solve. And I was able to do that because I worked at a marketing agency where I was the only developer, and we had another developer come in, and then at the next job, I was basically the lead on a web hosting platform we built. So kind of had to just learn. And then I was at Commerce Guys, where I just learned a lot from Boy and Ryan and all. Yeah, so I guess that's just it. Experience and being fortunate enough to hit the hard problems and take advantage of the hard problems too. One thing I believe, like there's no such thing as good luck. You just make the best of your opportunities. Well, good luck to me is making sure that you capitalize on any opportunity. So if you see it, just try to take it and learn with it. I've definitely bit off more than I can chew lots of times, and more times than not, I've come out okay. There's a few times that I had egg on my face because I failed, but I learned from that. So that's one thing too. Failure is a bad word. There's just times that you didn't succeed and you learned. How do I get around Drupal without using views? Custom modules that create the entity or database. Basically, most of the views that I've had to build didn't need to have filtering involved. So that's one thing. Views, if you need to list content and have filters, yeah, use views because it's so much easier. But a lot of times if it was just like a set list, like recent news articles, entity query, all the way, so much easier. and a little bit faster than using views. Never querying the database directly. If I needed something that was like a direct database query, it would be in a view. But otherwise, just try to use entity field. Well, in D7, it was entity field query. In D8, it's entity query. Whenever you have like a concise set of things that are needed, views is good for contrib. So that way you can make it easier for other folks to customize. But a lot of times, just custom module with the exact query I need. All right, let's go on to I hope that answers that. Let's go to one of the other questions that was submitted earlier. So covered the submodules. And let's see if this works. All right. So this is a really cool question that came in. Is open source to you a tinkerer's hobby, a mission to benefit the world by unlocking value, or pragmatically a toolkit to make particular projects more successful? I like this question because it's a very interesting one. And it's kind of all of the above. I am not a mechanical person. Like how I said, I like to tinker and tear things apart. If you asked me to do that to a car or like anything electronic, I would break it and I would be horrible with it. I can build things in wood when I need to, but I'm not that kind of tinkerer. I am with code. So open source is a great tinkerer's hobby. It's like I want to learn things, and I can read a book on, architecture design, like software architecture design, but I'd much rather dig into open source code that implements those practices. And also, it's just fun. I like to share knowledge. I believe that knowledge should be shared. Whenever you learn something cool, find some way to put it out there so somebody else can find it. And creating open source software is that. Open source means the source is open. Doesn't mean it needs to be. There's no strings attached. You can just be like, hey, I built this cool thing, throw it out there, let everybody view how it works. But you're not obligated to maintain it or keep it working. It's just a thought experiment. Unfortunately, sometimes just throwing something out there gets popular and then you kind of are assumed to maintain it and fix it. But it's equally okay to be like, I just put this out here to share it. If it doesn't work for you, figure it out. A mission to benefit the world by unlocking value. That as well, one reason. So I worked at Commerce Guys, rebranded Centauro for the past 6 or 7 years. And one of my favorite parts about it was building Drupal Commerce. I still work on Drupal Commerce. It's not like my main thing anymore. Was being able to build a platform that let anybody start an online store. And maybe not so much the online store part because there's Shopify, but people were using it to make their custom businesses succeed. There's a company out in Oregon or Washington that sells they rent scientific equipment. You can't do that on other platforms. Drupal Commerce let them build their online store to make their business work. There's a company in Michigan, one of my clients, they use it to beat their competitors because their competitors are still using faxes to communicate with their sales and vendors. Their clients and vendors, rather. And they're able to harness Drupal Commerce to tie into their back office with their sales and built this whole system that's not off the shelf. They had to customize it to meet their unique needs, and they're able to beat the competition. That unlocked value that supported a small and local business. And by the way, when they say small SMB, like small, medium business, those are under $25 million. So if there's a way that any open source stuff I work on helps anybody, even in that $1 million to $10 million tier, that's a win for me. And I like seeing that happen because that empowers individuals and that empowers local communities instead of everything necessarily going up to the top. So there is some altruistic things there. And pragmatically, a toolkit to make particular projects more successful. I believe open source projects are more successful than closed sourced ones due to the fact that, there might be a bug, but somebody can pick up the torch. If you going back to e-commerce, there's somebody who had their software go end of life. The company was like, yeah, we're not doing this anymore. And they had no choice but to re-platform, and Drupal Commerce was the only thing that fit them. Open source, if let's say it's the hit by a bus factor, right? If Boyan, myself, or Ryan, or Jonathan got hit by a bus, and like, let's say we're at DrupalCon and the plane just crashed, to be cryptic. Just because we weren't around to maintain Drupal commerce, the community could step up and make a difference. They could keep on building the platform. It is not gone. Same thing for Drupal. You know, when it's later on and the current committer team is gone, and maybe Dries is on something else, not that he would, but to be theoretical, the project can keep going and it can remain successful. So that's one reason that I really enjoy open source, because it's this idea of continual improvement and the fact that the torch can keep being passed on to others that are using the project. Good example is Kubernetes. Kubernetes is like the operating system for a data center. It started out inside Google, named Borg, or they still have Borg, but Kubernetes is like a spin out, and they spun it out, and it was quickly adopted by, like, you know, IBM uses it. Amazon has their own Kubernetes cluster. Azure does. And now even the Kubernetes like committer team, I think only 1/4 of the team is Googlers. The rest is everybody else from other companies. So open sourcing this tool made it more successful, more stable, exposed it to more edge cases, and now everybody's able to compete on different edges in the technology stack. That's one thing that's important too, is you're not going to win out on your technology. It's going to win out on all of your other things. Actually, that's really vague. But the idea is that you can share and use some of the same technology stack and actually build it together, but still compete on other things that matter more. So that's where I think open source is great, because you can compete yet collaborate as well on different levels. See what's next. All right. As an open source contributor, how do you keep yourself engaged but avoid burnout by trolls, others who might take advantage of your contributions? What advice would you share in that regard? That's, I don't know how I keep myself engaged. Honestly, this one kind of hits home, because there's been plenty of times I like was ready to throw my hands in the air and say screw it. Like in March when I said I was going to stop I was going to just in March I put out a blog post that said I was going to halt development indefinitely of PHP stand Drupal and Drupal check until I could figure out some kind of funding. Because it just felt like too much to bear. This had nothing to do with trolls, but just the having to be engaged and feeling like there's all these agencies out there that were selling Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 upgrades, Drupal 9 to Drupal 10 upgrades, and then I'm over here like, I'm building the tool you're using, and I'm sitting here just trying to do good and not making any money off of it. Not that the goal is to like make insurmountable income off of it, but you know, if I'm going to do it, I want to make some money. Like, I want my time to be paid. I don't want it to be my nights and weekends. I have 3 kids. I have a family. And at that point, I know I posted that blog post, but that blog post saying like, hey, I need to figure out funding, but I was actually going to unpublish the packages and just kind of let the world burn. That point, because I was burnt out. And usually what I do, that was probably the most burnt out I felt with Drupal commerce. It was actually pretty often, because there's a lot of people in Slack that constantly ask, or they talk crap. And they're like, oh, well, Drupal commerce doesn't do this, but Shopify does. It's like, cool. Shopify raised like venture capital, a lot of money. We are a handful of people building a platform. And whenever somebody sponsors work, that's what we build. We don't just sit and build things to build things. So I try to find the good. I take the break. Whenever I feel like the burnout coming, I try to take the break. But I try to find the good, the wins. You know, there's always trolls. There's always jerks. Like somebody called Boyan like a murderous Serb and some other stuff. Like I have the screenshot saved somewhere from IRC. I totally went off on Boyan and it was ridiculous. And it can be ridiculous, but when you're in that space, it eats at you, because it's like, why am I using my time to do this if this one person says these things? So it's just like when you read one, you could read 100 good comments, read the one bad one, and it just sets the mood. So I try to remember all the good things. and just take the break, like log out of Drupal Slack on my computer. I try to keep it off my phone. It ends up sneaking back on here and there. But I just close it out. I'm like, nope, not this week. I'm just not going to at all. Because in reality, if you don't touch this stuff for a week, it doesn't matter. Like, it's just, it'll be there. So I try to keep myself engaged by finding the good parts and also talking about it too. I spent the past year maybe talking about open source and funding open source. I've been inspired by Dries, who has written blog posts about the makers and takers of open source. I'm gonna try to find that link and share it. Although his homepage doesn't show all of the, I have to click on blogs. Balancing makers and takers to scale and sustain open source. I'll share this in the chat. It's a really good blog post. And I think about the fact that, there are project leads and other open source projects that are trying to solve this problem. And others who take advantage of the contributions. Let's face it, I've got a modest house and my office is kind of a mess. Like, I'm not exactly rolling in cash. So yeah, all my contributions are taken advantage of. But that's just what happens when you contribute to open source. You scale out your contribution scales up so far that it's almost impossible to get back the amount of time you put into it. So yeah, it's just, let's say, okay, to be on usually when I did the sponsorships, it's about $100 an hour. And to get PHP Stand Drupal ready and Drupal Check ready, float a Drupal Camp, which shout out to Mike Herschel, one of the main coordinators from there, and that whole team. He's in the chat, M. Herschel. They sent me $2,000 as sponsorship to get that over the edge, so 20 hours of work. I actually took 500 of that and sent it to Andre, the maintainer of PHP Stand, because I didn't feel good just taking the whole chunk to work on my thing when it's also built on other open source. So that's one thing about taking advantage of others' contributions. I'm taking advantage of other people's contributions as well. I have a whole topic about funding open source and individuals basically funding other individuals and the snake eating itself. So, I built that problem, but I built those tools, but how much money have agencies made off of PHP Stand and then PHP Stand Drupal or even Drupal Check to land upgrade deals that probably they probably sell for $5,000 a pop and make $4,000 off of, if not more. But business is business, so I'm not really going to complain because I made money. I made enough to cover my time. That wasn't my nights and weekends, and I still could pay my bills. And so you can make the same argument of so many things in Drupal. Yeah, so many things in Drupal, so many things in open source. Like with Bluehorn Digital, I'm currently sponsoring. Let me see. I want to try to look up my current sponsors. So with Bluehorn Digital, my company, I'm sponsoring Lando at $9 a month. I use Lando for some local development projects. Sebastian Bergman, $10 a month for PHP unit. Composer, $10 a month because, hey, I can't do my job without the Composer package manager. Derek Reithens for Xdebug at $25 a month. PHP Stand at $5 a month. Jeff Geerling at $10 a month because I use a lot of infrastructure stuff. Clue Engineering with React PHP, $15 a month because I use a lot of the async stuff for local tools. I'm gonna butcher this. Sasha Eggenberger, the person behind the Gin theme, because I use Gin on all of my sites, including a SaaS I'm trying to work on. Daniel Espindler, $15 a month because he creates all the PHP Storm plugins I use. Thomas Vertuba, $5 a month for Rector. And then lately I've started doing Kristen Pohl for $100 a month to be a core triage person. So I'm trying to find ways for Bluehorn Digital to give back because every dollar that I make is made off of other contributions that someone has made. So I'm going to get back to the chat. So on that point, what can we do to make Drupal more sustainable? If you've ever gone to a WordCamp, the difference in money is ridiculous. I had a chat about this in the spring. I did a Tag One team talk with Michael Myers, And also we talked about it at DrupalCon. And it's basically, what if the DA could create a slush fund? Again, we're putting more onus on the Drupal. The DA is the Drupal Association for anybody who's not familiar with Drupal. The problem is the Drupal Association is already on a tight budget with a much as the right amount of staff as it can afford, while still operating and managed to run Drupal.org and the Drupal cons and everything else it's doing, and to promote Drupal in the business community. But the idea is to take the Drupal 8 acceleration fund. So Drupal 8 was kind of stagnating in its development. We needed to just get it over the edge. So there's the D8 Accelerate Fund, which paid individuals $100 an hour, like core committers, to help core contributors to get it over the edge. And is why couldn't we make that long standing? What if we can make a fund that then individuals could request grants for to work on Drupal projects? So that would be like what Mike's referring to as donate to this fund, and we'll distribute it equitably depending on what modules are being used. It's just, that's hard to do. One thing I'll try to share, I'm going to switch to my desktop and hopefully this works out. Gitcoin Foss Fund. I want to try to find something that Open Collective and Gitcoin are working on. Nope, that's just the Gitcoin. Gitcoin grants. So Gitcoin grants is one thing that is alive, and it's a way to do funding. But again, it's all like crypto based, and a lot of it, this is the hard part. There's a lot of this talk going on in the crypto space, but it's all towards crypto projects. Like I've used Gitcoin bounties I've made, like 3 ETH way back when it was like $50 coin, to contribute to a few projects, which is really incentive, but everything is a crypto project. And let's see if Open Collective Gitcoin Foss funds. I want to try to find nope, there it is. The second one. Maybe. Fund OSS collective page. So there's this Fund OSS crowdfund matching, and this is like what we need to do inside Drupal. And there is, now I can't remember the name. Somebody's pinged me on Twitter at Drupal Slack a few times about even integrating this into Drupal itself, like a Drupal module. But the idea is to do, let's see, Gitcoin results, is to do like a quote unquote slush fund or like donation fund that can be distributed to end users or end contributors. It's a space that is evolving, and it's a hard problem to solve because somebody has to also be the caretaker of that money. And like, what does that mean to take care of that much money and distribute it? That is where, crypto and smart contracts actually helps solve that, because it takes humans partly out of the equation. But then the money's in crypto, which is neat, but maybe not the best for everybody. Like, I don't mind if I get paid in crypto because, well, for me, it's just an asset. Maybe somewhere else, crypto is viable because even though crypto fluctuates in price, it's more stable than inflation rates. I don't know. I just feel like this whole thing of like, how can we create a fund without having micro donations from individuals? It just also starts adding more problems as well, but at least we're talking about it. So my advice to just top that all off is, if you're feeling burned out and you contribute to open source, or it's just like, why am I doing this? Like, if you're questioning like why you're doing this, just stop for a week. Just be like, I don't need to answer these issue queues. Like, these people aren't necessarily, I don't owe anything to anybody using my code except for the fact I shared it and they're benefiting from it either by education or using it. Or just say like, look, I would love to help you out, but I need funding to set aside time. And that's what I've started to do. I don't mind answering questions here and there. I select a few folks. I'm like, look, I'm not going to charge you. If you ever have a question, just drop me one. I know you will respect my time. But other times when I get like a random message, I'm like, look, I would like to help you, but I have a day. I am running a business and I have my normal job. I cost $100 an hour. If you need a question solved, we can book a calendar slot time. And that so far has worked. Whenever somebody needs a quick answer, I will, say, look, I'll get back to it eventually. Sometimes it's a month later because I'm not good at that, but I will just straight up say my time costs money. In order to allocate time for this, I need to stop using time somewhere else. So I need you to fill that funding gap. And that's how I've kind of worked around the burnout, because I'm not just sitting there like, oh, I'm wasting my time. I'm spending my nights. Also, I've stopped working on nights with open source stuff. So nighttime is fun time for me, for anything that I've been curious to learn about or just not doing anything. But I stopped working on open source projects at night and on the weekends. That has also helped immensely, because the weekend is, family time, or nighttime is just like hangout time. For the record, I was a hobbyist coder for a long time, so my hobby became my profession. So I have a really hard time disassociating between hobby and work. So that's where coding became a hobby again, when I used nighttime to not work on anything open source that I use, unless my project's using an open source project and I need to fix a bug. But I don't triage like issue queues on my free time anymore. It's definitely a interesting topic. And one thing that I have seen done well is Clue Engineering, the React PHP folks, is they have it's called sponsorware, where they have their projects, but if you sponsor them, you get access to private projects. So to sponsor it, that's how you get access to it. There's also something in Laravel that was somebody in the Laravel community came up with the term sponsorware. I think that's where Livewire, the like weird half blade PHP / JavaScript framework, came out, was through sponsorware, and then it was open sourced. All right, let's go to the next question. All right. What hobbies do you spend time on besides coding? That's a good follow-up. And by the way, I set it up that it randomly pulls questions. There was 45 questions in the Google form beforehand. And every time I ping the node server, it grabs a random key. So I had question 8, 17, this is 13. What hobbies do you spend time on besides coding? Well, I'm a big fan of coffee, so I've become a coffee snob thanks to Ryan, because he introduced me into doing pour over coffees. So I make coffee and I drink bourbon. That's about it. But I like to go cycling, so I ride my bike all over the place. For the first time, I bought a road bike, and I'm very excited about it. Being 6'4", it's hard to find a road bike that fits me, that's not brand new. So I was able to find a nice carbon fiber frame and stupid nice wheels for about $1,400, and I've rode that about 500 miles over the summer. School went back in session, and I take morning walks with my wife, so I haven't been able to ride my bike as much. But basically, cycling is my main hobby, and then just playing with kids. So between kids and work, I don't really have time for my own hobbies, which I'm fine with, because my kids like Legos, and I love Legos too. All right, what has kept you away from Fang? Which, hold on, isn't there like a new one that includes Microsoft in this, because Microsoft became cool again? It's like Fangming. So Fang is the acronym given to Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google. Or maybe are they just called? Is it just these few because they're all in the same area? So that's why it's Fang and Microsoft got dropped off. I don't know. Either way, besides the point. What kept me away from it is I was a self-taught coder. I went to school to get a better job, but I got the better job while still in school. And I don't like the idea of relocating. For any of those, I'd have to move. And by the time I became a professional developer and established, we already had 2 children. Let's see. No. First, Our oldest is 10 and was born when I was still delivering beer. Our second one, who's now 6, was born 2 months after I quit my one job to join Commerce Guys. So I praise my wife for dealing with me with that, for doing a job transition while she was 8 months pregnant. So it kept me away because I don't want to have to move for my job. I was already remote for 2 years once I became a quote, quote, professional developer and felt like I made it. And I never thought I could get hired at one either. Like, just hearing all the horror stories about their interview process, I was like, I don't have time for that. Like, I don't have like a classic software engineering degree. I got my degrees at University of Phoenix, and I feel like it was a complete waste of my money. Kind of, it taught me some neat things about project management and being a software lead, but I didn't feel like I received the same kind of education that you see from like in-person universities that the people who get hired at these fangs like go to. So I just didn't. I always thought it'd be cool, but I do like the idea of like I've worked in smaller companies and more close knit. Yeah, Apple is hiring Drupal developers. You need to move to Austin or Cali. Um, you know, I did hear about like some Amazon jobs, but it's like I'm not moving out there. Like I like the Midwest pace, I guess. So for those who don't know, I live in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Like if I were to go mile and a half that way, not underground in my basement, but up. The lake's right there, so I can go for runs by the lakefront. I can go for bike rides. Milwaukee's 45 minutes north via car because we have no trains. But Chicago is an hour and 45-minute train ride because we actually have a train to go to Chicago. It's a nice location. The worst part is actually getting to the airport. If you got a 5 a.m. flight, there's not many options for getting there. So I like where I am. I don't want to have to uproot my family for my job. Now, if this was earlier on and we didn't have kids or I was single, sure. I mean, why not? Like, who wouldn't go work at one of these just to be like, do you know what I did? I worked at Apple. I worked at Google. It's got clout. It sounds cool. But the fact that, we have kids, the ones in school, well, now the two are in school, it just feels too disruptive. Like, I don't want to be that dad who's like, well, we have to move for business because I chose to take another job, not because my business moved me. Growing up, I had a few friends that, they had to move because their parents' jobs made them or their parents were in the military. Like, that's one thing when you're forced to move, but when it's like, I decided to take this other job and we have to move, I feel like that's not fair and that's like a selfish decision. And I didn't want to put that on, my kids, because then if we need somebody to watch the kids, we don't know anybody there. Then we got to pay for childcare if like my wife needs to go do something, or also just cost of living more expensive. Like, yeah, I might make, what is it? You might make like 200 grand, but also the cost of living, maybe it's not like to go buy groceries, but to go buy a place to live is 3 times as more expensive. So unless I got like a really sweet offer, I don't think I would ever be enticed by one of those, unless they did work from home, then maybe. But mostly what kept me away is just I didn't think I was good enough and I didn't want to move. So I guess it came in that order. First was I didn't think I was good enough. Then when I thought it might be good enough, I was like, I don't actually want to move to go work at one of these companies. I don't think it would give me as much fulfillment or benefit besides money. If I'm going to work, if we're destined to have to work a lot to just do life, I want to at least enjoy it and have fun. I don't want it to be just about the money. Which is one reason that I still keep coming back to open source, because it gives a little bit more to it. All right, next one. What drives you to create new open source project or services? How do you choose which idea is worth pursuing? I don't often make new open source projects. What happened, probably the biggest one, let's go back. I have a few, but they're not like widely used. So Contrib Kanban is a project that I built. I'm going to switch back to the desktop for a second. So Contrib Kanban, I wrote this originally in like 2014 as I wanted to learn Angular. I wanted to learn how to do a mean stack, Mongo, Express, Angular, and Node. So I wrote a JavaScript app that takes a Drupal.org issue queue and converts it into a sprint board. If we go to Drupal core, did I put in? Why is Drupal Florida Camp there? Well, those are backwards too. Let's pick. Oh, sure. Let's just pick this one. So what it will do is it will query the Drupal.org API to create a Kanban board. This one's taking a while. When I was working at a company, we had a lot of patches because we built a hosting platform on top of Compatibility, which is a distro that has a bunch of Contrib. So we had patches on patches on patches, and I needed a way to monitor them. And the Drupal.org issue queue was kind of a pain. So I created a way to display them in a Kanban board. And I used that as a way to learn AngularJS, how to run Express. It first was using parse.com. So it wasn't Mongo, it was parse.com. So it was Peen, Parse, Express, Angular, and Node. So I ran that for a bit. And then it became like Drupal 8. I was like, hey, let's turn it into Drupal 8. So it's been always my experiment. So I guess when it comes to new open source project, does it scratch an itch? Is it something I want to create? PHP Stand Drupal was at Centauro in December, maybe 3 years ago. We were trying to figure out like how to provide services to Drupal commerce sites. And one thing was the support toolkit. I can't remember what we called it, but some kind of toolkit. And it was like do static code analysis. So one weekend I sat and found PHP Stand, wrote the integration, and I was like, hey, here's PHP Stand Drupal, and prototyped it. And then we never really used it as a product in Centauro, but we found out, like when talking to Gabor, we found out like, hey, this could actually be really useful for the Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 upgrade. Oh, it can do deprecations. So then I contributed to PHP Stand to improve the way it reads deprecations. And then PHP Stand Drupal just kind of took off. Then I got an email from Dries that said, hey, what if we made something called Drupal Check that wrapped. I wrote about this in another blog that I'll share that gives a bit more of the history. But it was basically like setting up PHP Stand back in the day was a real big pain. Not a big pain. It had extra steps. But that was also the time when the Drupal community was like, Composer is evil. So it helped lower the barrier. I put the link in the chat. Which I just realized the chat's not scrolling. So I broke the CSS somehow. That stinks. Composer isn't evil. I mean, it's less evil than doing drush make files and managing everything yourself and forgetting about a dependency. But it just kind of happened organically. It was just built this tool. Hey, it solved this problem. And then it just kind of cascaded from there. So how do you choose which idea is worth pursuing? For that, it's just I also throw up a lot of examples, and I kind of just think it stems from there. Like on the Bluehorn Digital repo or GitHub organization, I created Mojo, which is my cloud native or 12 form factor Drupal build, where it uses a object storage out of the box. So like S3 or DigitalOcean Spaces has Redis connected for all caching, because there are no Drupal templates that are optimized for hosting in the cloud, where your local disk storage is ephemeral and not persistent, and you have to use object storage through a service instead of what's on your disk, because Drupal is just hosted in a pod somewhere that could float around to any node. So like I did that just to share knowledge, and if people are like, hey, we use this, is I spun it out into its own scaffolding tool, so that way I could reuse it. And if that took off, then great, it does. But just basically, if it scratches an itch, and I feel like I wrote it, I may as well share it. I'll put it up on GitHub. And so I usually just pursue random things. If something comes to fruition, I think others might find it cool, I'll put it up on GitHub. If I'm like, there's no way I'm putting this up here because there's going to be too many questions and too many bugs and people might use it, then I don't, because I don't have time to deal with that. One example is I built a Web3 enabled payment gateway for Drupal Commerce, where you could purchase stuff, and then it would open your wallet, and you could pay with Ethereum or Brave attention token, or the basic attention token, BAT, and it would bring you to a page which does the asynchronous wait while the transaction clears. But I never open sourced that because it was just, I didn't like, one, do I put it on Drupal.org? Do I put it on GitHub? Do I feel like maintaining it if somebody uses it? In that case, I really didn't want to, especially being like in the spotlight as a Drupal Commerce co-maintainer. I was like, this is just going to be some pet code that I have to decide until one day I decide I actually want to publish it. A lot of times I just throw it out there because it can't really do any harm. The worst part could be like, hey, sorry, I just put it out as an example. I'm not going to maintain it. But there is no secret sauce. Just kind of do things. And if I think it's interesting, I'll release it. I guess that could tie into one part. When working on a client, how do you know what to open source and what not to? I think that's a good question here. And the question is also, it depends. It depends on, do you think you could use it again? Do you think others would use it and you can offload your maintenance to others who may use it? Which always sounds like a great plan, but that's why there's so many desolate modules. It's like, oh, I've got this client and they'll use this code and maybe somebody else will pick it up. But if it's useful, especially to the greater, like thinking of commerce, to the greater commerce community. One example was when working with another agency, they wanted to be able to manage their product variations by downloading a CSV template, editing it, and uploading it. So the result was commerce product variation CSV, which gave a whole different way to manage your product variations per product using a CSV. Well, we could have just built that and put it in the client code, but it's like, this was useful to the platform or is something that could be incubated, maybe brought into core. So that was made a Contrib. I don't think it's really been advanced since then because it just works. But it's one of those things that we decided to open source because it makes the platform overall better, and it could be used to gauge interest on what should move into Commerce Core itself. So that's one thing I think about open source too, is like maybe evaluate, like, is this part of a bigger picture, and is it something that could end up into the main project or could be valuable to the community as a whole? Like with one thing I'm going to be working on soon, I plan on, normally my Fridays are like hack and play where I just pick something to work on and I work on it. But what I want to work on is an open API converter that takes the open API document and turns it into Laravel models. So it's probably out there, but something that takes the open API spec, generates your Laravel models, and customizes the cast and the date formats and what's hidden or not, and writes the code. And also then create one that creates the type data plugins for Drupal. Because I've been a big proponent of the JSON API spec in Drupal, but I'm also like, sometimes I don't want to deal with that. Sometimes I just want to write my own API and then have it meet that standard. So that, I guess that's one thing is, again, it's going to be an open source package I make. Is it going to take off? I don't know, but I think it would be neat and useful to share. So that's how I decided. Is it fun? Do I want to talk about it? Do I want to like let other people see it? Are you involved consistently in any meetups? Drupal, Laravel, or other? Used to. So I used to go to Drupal 414, which was the Milwaukee meetup ran by David Snopek. And there's like a handful of people there, but it kind of was always like the same people. And then always the same maintainers or event runners. So, people get tired of running and the same speakers get tired of speaking. I tried to run one here in Kenosha. I had Drupal 262 for like a year. But again, being the main runner and speaker, I was like, I'm tired. Like, I don't want to keep doing this. And then also just like meetups are at night. They're during the week. Like once we had like the second kid, now we have the third kid. Like, I don't have free time to just sit and go to a meetup. I would like to because it's like, mingling with people, but I wouldn't mind if it was at like 3:00 in the afternoon. And it's how I spent like, like happy hour somewhere. Not everything has to be involved around drinking, but, get a little snack because happy hours have half off food too sometimes. So like, it was like 3 to 5 or, the local business, the Chamber of Commerce has they call these things like business after 5. So they start at 5 o'clock, and the idea is like leave your job a little bit earlier, you know, because it's like for like local businesses. You go there, it's like from 5 to 7, not from 7 to 9 o'clock at night. You know, my kids go to bed at 8. I want to say goodnight to them. Just, I value those things over work. So I'm not consistently involved in any meetups. You know, I've been wanting to do more crypto based things, but like that, it's like, oh, go to meetups. I'm like, I don't want to. Like, I don't want to go to a meetup. I don't want to network more than I have to. I enjoy going to conferences, but trying to go to like a monthly meetup is just a lot of work, in my opinion. And I've tried to do virtual ones too, but I can't. I've been bad at the whole like virtual conference, virtual meetups. I can't sit in front of my computer and get away from any of the other distractions. I need to be by people and have that actual in-person experience. All right. So this goes back to, this question was actually lingering from back when I did a live stream on Friday, creating Commerce Conditions Plus. So after watching your live stream on Friday, I saw you creating some commerce conditions that were reminiscent of Rule 7, basically creating rules in Drupal 8, rules for commerce. Why did we move away from rules? Where can I find out more of this discussion if we are not re-implementing something similar? So for those who aren't familiar with Drupal commerce or Drupal had the rules module, which was a logic condition, a event condition action engine. You could build some really robust things. It was the heart and core of Drupal commerce in D7, and also the biggest pain point for performance and any maintenance of a project. In Drupal 8, rules wasn't ready yet, and we had to make an explicit decision not to use rules in Drupal commerce 2 because we didn't want to have to also maintain rules or push it forward. So we had to write our own condition system because Core kind of had one and it didn't work. So we wrote our own, but it's very limited. And I have a client that is sponsoring some time to build a more robust interface. And I'm basically rewriting rules because it'd be not rewriting rules, rewriting a lot of the interface for rules into the commerce condition system because it would be too much work to embed rules right now. And I don't even know if rules is stable yet. So it's been interesting. We actually started working on that project again, where we have it that you can do nested conditions. So we're starting to add and or support and negation by having nested items in the table. Thoughts and experiences with pair programming. Do it. If you have the opportunity to, do it. I love pair programming because it's just, it helps, especially if you're a senior working with a junior. Pair program all the time. At least do like an hour session a week, just to see how they're doing and help teach lessons. Yesterday, when talking about that Commerce Conditions Plus, we did it for 2 hours. I was the one coding and bouncing ideas off with them. Even if like working on architecture documents, because if you haven't, sorry, 1 second. Brain. If you've ever had to sit and write an architecture document or like an analysis of a code base, you end up having your eyes glaze over and then your head falls over and you smack your head on the desk as you slightly fall asleep. Paired programming exercises help there too, because it just kind of keeps you mentally alert and you're discussing the problem with somebody else. So do video calls with that, or if you're in the office, like sit next to somebody and work on the problem at the same time. One person gets the computer, the other person just watches like it's back in the 90s and you're playing video games. I think that's a great experience, especially for finding bugs, because we've all been there, right? You miss that semicolon, you miss that one parentheses, and you sit there for an hour like, why doesn't the code work? Where is it broken? Or something. That other set of eyes is probably catching things that you're glossed over while you're in your own head working on the problem. So paired programming is worth it. The only problem is that it adds cost, right? It doubles the cost because 2 people are working on the same thing and not something else. And it's technically some people would say it's a loss of velocity because on paper it is, but in reality, I think it improves productivity and increases velocity because you have 2 eyes on the same problem, which reduces bugs. and you're teaching. Somebody's going to be a senior, somebody's going to be more knowledgeable in one area, and the other person is either learning or maybe they know something different, and they're going to grow in that case. And that's where I think paired programming is a must. So if you can try to like inflate your estimates to ensure that paired programming happens, I think you should, wherever it's reasonable. Going back to the chat, because since I broke the chat and it's not scrolling, an alternative to rules in D8 and D9 might be ECA. I think I know this. I should know this. I think I got the demo of this. Drupal.org project EC, not RVS. ECA. Event condition action. Yes. This would be an equivalent or alternative to rules in D8. I encourage you to check this out. I did get a demo of this. It's super cool. What is it? So BPMNIO is so BPN is a modeler, and Camunda is a desktop client. So let's see, blog post, slides. Let's see if I can just get the slides up. It's really cool. If we can get, okay, pictures. I just want to show. So you define different events and you can kind of click and build things together. So it's a workflow builder. So it is like rules, but you can actually build it in a, you can download the desktop client, Camunda, and then import the XML to Drupal, and it will build the actions. Now that it's not inside Drupal entirely, but it is super cool and solves this idea of like building customizable business logic inside a Drupal site without writing any code. Or rather, not writing any PHP code, because, you know, there's some XML in there. And despite what anybody may say, markup language is still programming and code because it has a syntax and you have to put it together right, otherwise it breaks. So HTML is programming. Same with CSS. Let's go to the next one. Hook updates and best principles for backwards compatibility with multiple environments. This is a Drupal deployment question. So I honestly don't have a good suggestion for rolling back a bad Drupal deployment, besides have a backup ready or try to do like a blue-green deployment. But I always run, so my principle is you don't run drush CR on deployment. You don't run cache rebuild on deployment. You write update hooks to invalidate what's needed. In most cases, that automatically happens when you import configuration and that configuration is modified and the cache tags get invalidated. But sometimes you need to rebuild. Actually, CSS and JavaScript aggregates are the worst offender because that can be impossible to invalidate. You have to actually call like the asset collector and invalidate it. So that is the one pain point and can add a lot of update hooks. But Drush does have a command to just invalidate those. So that could be one thing, although you have to be careful if you use page cache. Well, one thing is I don't actually use the page cache module in Drupal. I just rely on dynamic page cache, so that problem doesn't happen. But best principles for backwards compatibility with multiple environments. That's one part. I'm not actually sure what this question might mean with backwards compatibility. Because with Drupal, we don't have a rollback system for updates. Like we don't have a way to say like undo this last update. So like if something fails, every update does run in a transaction though. So if you were to, let's see, let me go back to my desktop really quick. So if you're leveraging Drupal update hooks, we could say Drupal update exception. Well, this is in, let's see. Let's go to, I wonder why, like in all the search engines, branch 8.2.x is what is stuck. So if you're writing an update hook and you want to roll back the current transaction during it running, if something goes wrong, you can throw an update exception, and that will cause, in the updater, it will cause the transaction to roll back. So that way it's like anything that happened during the update process didn't actually occur. The problem is the code was still deployed and some other updates may have run. So that could be difficult. Backwards compatibility is multiple environments. So I'm not sure what that might mean. But hook updates, just be mindful of any data you're making. In Drupal, we have hook update, which is intended for schema changes. And then we have post updates. So hook update modifies schema, like if you need to install any new base fields and entity, modify stuff that's in the database schema. And then post update is used for modifying config or any entities themselves, because that's when the system is considered stable and caches have been rebuilt. So we have a two-step upgrade process. Go to the next one. Drupal 9 upgrade biggest challenges: not using my own tools. I upgraded my personal site live on a stream, and I didn't even run PHP stand Drupal or Rector or upgrade status, and I just completely shot myself in the foot because I relied on Composer to tell me the truth. So I think honestly the biggest upgrade challenge is the fact that some modules haven't had maintainers do anything with the modules, and the community at large hasn't really decided on what to do. There's been talk about allowing there to be like community maintainers that go ahead and commit the compatibility patches and tag releases for things that need it. But that's also like a big policy change. Like we're saying that, sorry, we're just giving random access to modules to other users to make changes to. So I think that's the biggest challenge, is just you picked X obscure module because it solved a problem. That person created it because their client needed it, and then they never went back to it ever again. And now you're using it, but you can't maintain it. And you can't easily fork it to have the updates. I know some folks have been working around it using issue forks. I believe Media Current wrote a blog post on that. So if you go to the search engines and say, Media Current, issue fork, Composer, I'm sure it'll come up. Because otherwise, like the code, it's not that hard to upgrade from Drupal 8 to Drupal 9. Like there's just some deprecated services. It's just like death by 1,000 paper cuts, or like walking in a room with the lights off and you stub your toe. You think you got you think you evaded all this stuff, and then there's a Lego on the ground, you step on it, then you kick the table on accident. It's just like that. Like they're not horrible problems. It's just you need to make sure you test everything and you run through everything right, so you don't have like a fatal error in production on accident because a service that was deprecated is still being called. That's what I had to happen to Contrib Kanban when I upgraded it to D9. For some reason, there's a gap in the services.yaml. So the YAML files, it found out that the code was referencing Entity Manager, which was deprecated and was removed in D9. And I fixed that. That was fixed, but the actual services.yaml was still out of date. So that's one thing that I want to get added to PHP stand Drupal, is to warn you when the services.yaml is invalid as well. But with static analysis, it's only as good as the humans write it, and only as good as the edge cases that are reported. So if you do run into any challenges, it's always good to like try to report them in the upgrade status module or PHP stand Drupal, so we can try to like catch it and see if we can warn people. Drupal Rector is used to automate the upgrades and fixing of the code and rewriting it, but it also doesn't handle services.yaml. So these YAML file definitions are kind of the Achilles heel, if you will. So that's when like you can run it, but just you got to click through the pages. You got to just try clicking through the pages and make sure, have some smoke tests ready. Smoke tests are just, you have like a script of how you click through the site to get a baseline of most of how the site interacts, and just go through that process. And maybe just finding time, I guess. Otherwise, it's really easy. It's just Composer update, like modify the version constraints, Composer update, bam. Right, next one. Crazy. 33 questions left. Scenarios where one should define a custom Drupal field. When you have unique data or data that's dependent on each other. So on one project, we had it where it could have been two different text fields, but the second text field was dependent on the data in the first one, and it's on an entity as well. So we could have wrote widgets that were we could have wrote custom field widgets that were like intertwined or customized the form, but instead I was like, how about we just make it a custom field, because it's a base field on our custom entity, and it's going to be two columns in the shared database table anyways, which is the same as having two different fields, two different string fields. So I wrote a custom field that said it had property Y, property X. Property X is dependent on, it shows things dependent on the value of Y. I realized I flip-flopped X and Y there. And then I wrote a custom field widget and formatter. So instead of having to write two custom widgets and try to dance around weird logic, I just put it all in one field. One project I'm working on is called Brewed Up. It's a coffee, like you check into your roast that you make and your different brews. It's like Untapped for coffee. That was originally a Drupal site, and I built some custom fields for like roast style. So roast, you can have the roast level, like light, medium light, dark, medium dark, and then there's technically like variants, like it's a dark roast, Vienna style, French roast, things like that. So instead of making those two fields, I made the one style field, and it has two properties of level and variant. So to kind of do grouping that way, where instead of just having two fields. Also, if you just need to have unique handling, so it's just kind of like if the requirements make sense, it's just like take your gut feeling. If you need a custom field type, to kind of also go with this, I try to avoid field config, so making fields via the user interface, unless it's nodes, because nodes are just a pain. But I try to always just define it in code using bundle fields from the entity module. So I'll do like hook my module field storage info, and then the entity bundle field hook, whatever it is, and define my bundle fields and have them installed that way. So that way I have less config and all of my fields are managed via code. It's definitely a more advanced thing to do, but I hate dealing with field config and the field UI, because I'm also a very particular person. If you've noticed in my streams, kind of get set in my ways and I do things my way, even if it's probably a bigger hassle than it's worth. All right. If I woke up with 10 million, what would I do next? If I woke up with $10 million, I would pay off my student loans, because that's still somehow there. My medical debt, because that's still there. It racks up. In, in the United States, it costs about like $5,000 to have a baby, even if you have insurance and nothing goes wrong. And just hope you don't, go in for a sprained wrist. Like, what was it? So last fall, I fell on my wrist, and like, I don't know if you could hear it, but like it cracks and it makes weird noises. That was like a $600 just to go like get it x-rayed, and told, we don't know. Looks like your scar tissue from your previous surgery got aggravated. Or turns out I pulled a neck muscle while holding our baby and sneezing, because I don't know, but they thought it was my thyroid. So they did like a neck ultrasound and all that. It was like $1,200, even with insurance, because I didn't hit the deductible. So if I woke up 10 million, I would take care of any of those lingering payments. Set aside money for my kids to do something with their future. Not like if they want to go to college, cool, but set aside money so they can do stuff they want. Let's see, 10 million is not a lot anymore, right? Probably set aside 2 million for each kid for their future, because college, like I've read reports that it'll cost $1 million to go to college for them. So set aside 2 million so that way they can have that. That's 6. Pay off some medical debt, put the rest aside for insurance. So I guess that whole 10 million would go to future planning, and maybe set aside 1 million to pay off debt, maybe buy a bigger car. which is sad if you think about it. Like $10 million doesn't get you much anymore. But I know that my kids' future and our like future would be sustained. Um, yeah, so I guess that's what I would do. I would put a cushion for the future. I'm going to go to a chat question. Should D9 sites choose custom inline blocks rather than paragraphs since one is core? I'm going to assume the inline paragraphs question is in regards to using Layout Builder. So is the question more about using Layout Builder versus paragraphs? I would say, as somebody who is all about panels in D7 land, and Layout Builder is basically panelizer, yes, use inline blocks. Don't use paragraphs. I don't like using paragraphs. Every time I've had to work on a site that uses paragraphs, I want to pull my hair out. No offense to the maintainers. I know the people that use it, they love it, but I've never really enjoyed working with paragraphs. And maybe it's just one of those, like, I haven't found the beauty of it. Same reason I don't like working with views very often. I wouldn't decide on what to use based off if it's in core or not. I would say what gets the job done the best. Because I do know there are going to be quirks with Layout Builder. It's not perfect either. Some people can build really amazing things with paragraphs because it lets you have like so paragraphs is nice because it's like you have a pre-built component library, but you can have the same thing too with inline blocks and block plugins. I guess it depends on what you want. In the end, the one thing I've noticed with whatever you choose, the client always talks about how they want flexibility and the content editors want the flexibility. But what you end up building with those isn't what they use at all. So you can pick one and you can give them like a component library that is out of this world and they use 1/4 of it and then ask for different changes and they don't use it the way that they said they would. So when thinking about using Layout Builder or paragraphs, go with what they're most competent with. Do they want to have a WYSIWYG's page builder or do they want to have buttons that they pick and say, I want to build this, and then paragraphs might be the best. But try to do it in a agile approach. So maybe it's all about prototyping. Like, hey, try using this with Layout Builder. Use paragraphs. What works best, and then build it from there. Don't just like build it and then hope it meets their content editing standards. Is what I would say. So always get feedback right away because people don't know what they want until they realize what they don't want. Right? Like to paraphrase like Ford, if people ask what they want, if he asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse, not a car. We don't know what we want until we know what we don't want. When we realize something that doesn't work, that's when we know what we want. Or at least not even what we want, but what we don't want. We know what we don't want. We don't know what we want. So prototype and ask questions often to try to discern what works best. Insights related to debugging Ajax calls. I'm going to assume again this goes into Drupal, but even not Drupal, it could be debugging your Ajax calls in any application. So let's go ahead and I'm going to pop on the desktop and see if I can come up with an example. Let's go back to Contrib Kanban again. So here's how I debug my Ajax calls. You'll even notice right away my dev tools when I hit Command Option I, or if you go to, what is it? More tools, not Task Manager. Developer tools, there it is. So you go to network and fetch/XHR. It always said XHR, which is what, like XML something request. But now it also says fetch because for the fetch standard. So if I were to click on, just do Acquia Purge. So let's say that, I went to that one core board and it was taking a while to load. I could see in here, here's all the Ajax requests that went through the page, the size, the time. If the board is still loading, I could use this to say, like, did it error out and I have bad error handling, or is it literally just still loading? So in here, this is the first request that goes over JSON API. So I can see the headers, where it's a GET request. Usually you care about the response headers. Cast Control 900 came through Cloudflare. It's JSON API. Whatever that means, variant cookie origin, Drupal cache was a hit, and also that it came through this Lagoon instance because it's hosted via Amazy and their Lagoon. And these are also the request headers. So a lot of times it's worth knowing what were the responses, especially if you're debugging caching. Preview gives you the the formatted view. Response is the plain text. Initiator, if you want to try to look into what created it. And of course, timing, if you want to debug into what it's taking. Time to first byte was 119 milliseconds. Kind of slow, even though it was served from Drupal cache. And then here we're looking at requests that were made to Drupal.org. And we can see their headers. That's how I usually debug those requests, is just to see what's going on. If you're debugging Drupal Ajax requests, xdebug, get xdebug, drop a breakpoint, and whatever is the callback, and see what's going on. Let's see, let's go to Drupal.org. Let's go to Simply Test. That's what I can think of. Let's find an example. Issues. All right. Let's see. This should have a merge request on it. So here we have several Ajax requests that were fired. We got branches per. This is where it tries to find this data for the Git issue fork. So it actually makes an Ajax request to GitLab. I use this all the time to figure out how I can tinker with the Drupal.org APIs and the GitLab instance. So you can use this to see, some of the feedback. Was this here? So checked if there was a tugboat preview. Gets my user from in here even. So there's that. Let me go back to the question. Related debugging Ajax calls. Definitely use the developer tools, hands down, to figure out if something failed, what the response was. Wow, this is always slow. Well, look at, we're doing a post instead of a get to the GraphQL instance. Now, that might be what has to be here. One reason I don't like GraphQL, I know you can do get with GraphQL, but I'm not going to go down that road today. But let's say that you have something that's running really slow and it's bypassing your varnish cache, your other cache. Well, you found out that somebody wrote code where it was doing a HTTP post, which is never cacheable, versus HTTP get, which is cacheable by CDNs, your reverse proxy, etc., Drupal. So that's one way to debug those Ajax calls. See if I can figure out how to get something. So one thing you could do too with like Drupal calls. So I'm going to click unfollow. So we'll see here, this went to the flag module. And sometimes in Drupal, if there's an error, you'll get like the Ajax dialog that pops up that gives no information at all because it's truncated. You can click here, and in the preview and the response, you should be able to see more of the error message that happens too. I'm going to refollow this. So then you can go in here, the initiator. Again, we can go through, and if we click, well, this doesn't have source maps, so it doesn't help out too much. But we would be able to see that, this is, and who knows what code this is. jQuery, that's actually in jQuery itself. And if we went flag click, so here we're inside the, we can get to the source. It says, okay, well, this is, scroll up too fast. Update link, flag link. So here's the flag module, here's its code. If we go back here again, even though it's in the pre-processed and aggregated code, we can see that the trigger came from flag click, which does element is this, blah, 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 Ajax post, and it goes and runs all this code as well. I just broke the source. Yeah, so that's how I go about debugging my Ajax calls, and those tips work whether it's Drupal Ajax or you're using a JavaScript framework or let's go to PHP stand. I know GitHub is built on Ruby, so it does things a little bit different. But you could review these API requests as well. So if we do issues, we can check the, so every time we hover over the card, we can see there. So it's not different. It's just GitHub actually returns HTML rendered in the backend, not data for it to be rendered in the browser via JavaScript, like some issues. So like, let's say that you were implementing a hover card type setup and you're like, again, it's bypassing varnish and whatever else. Well, here they're doing a get. We can see cache control. Well, it's max age of 0. So you have to refresh it all the time. But you can just see where, you know, some of the insights into here as well. I'm going to go back to the chat. I'm so mad. I broke the chat widget. I finally got it styled, and apparently now it doesn't scroll. Like, I just can't win with this. So as soon as fields get nested in paragraphs, also mind the data model. Yep. Chris Vanderwater, Eclipse GC, had a good talk about the implications about that at MidCamp last year. Ooh, so if you were to go to, I know I took away. So if you were to go to 2020midcamp.org and go to schedule, I'm sure you can find that, or go to YouTube or Drupal.tv, I think is a thing, and find that up as well. It's an interesting topic. When it comes to content modeling, there is no wrong or right way. To some people there is, but there isn't a concrete way to do it. And this is going back to the whole discussion about layout builder and paragraphs. Just do what works best and is most feasible. Next question. How did you meet your wife? How do you know she was the one? Your data model is terrible was the name. So look up Your Data Model is Terrible. That is not how I met my wife. On YouTube for MidCamp. So this is funny. I met my wife at a friend's house. We had the same friends out of circle. How did you know she was the one? I don't know. It just kind of happened. Yeah, we just started. Well, she was hard to get. Not didn't play hard to get, but I actually like spent time like getting to know her, and it just happened. I actually ended up proposing 6 months into the relationship, and then we got married a year and a half after we were together. So we got married young though. Like she was 20, she turned 21 2 weeks after our wedding, and I was 21 like a week after our wedding. So it worked, and it's one of those, like, when they say when you know, that was it. So happily married now. 11 years. Yeah, 2010, 11 years. Would I say that you are more of a back-end, front-end, or full-stack engineer? Does it matter to you? Do you have a preference? This was like a recent revelation where I was always calling myself a back-end software engineer because I primarily wrote in the back-end. But I realized I also did a lot of front-end stuff, but I didn't call myself a front-end engineer because when I did front-end stuff, it wasn't necessarily styling, it was JavaScript. So I am starting to call myself a full-stack engineer, or I will call myself a back-end engineer, but full-stack architect, because I may not know how to do everything in the front end, but I can architect how the front-end application should work. I can write the initial scaffolding for the application and application state in React or Vue, and also full stack. Like, let's face it, we were all full stack developers back in the day. We all had to know how to manage our own server and be able to deploy it. Now, like, I know how to run the Kubernetes cluster and the CI and CD process that gets it deployed and has backend and front end code. The title doesn't really matter to me anymore because I like to think that I'm moving. Right. I think I'm moving to that next step. As developers, you go from like writing code to becoming more architect and more manager to not writing code as much anymore because you help other people write code. So to me, it really doesn't matter. I think I'm moving more into that like architect and solutions engineer over just like writing code. So I don't care about the title much. I kind of wear the full stack with pride that if I go into an environment or situation, I could help solve the problem regardless if it's JavaScript or Rust or Go or PHP, whatever you may have. They can just do it. If I have a preference, I don't actually have a preference. I like doing both of the things. I like working on JavaScript applications and building reactive interfaces. I am not design or UX person, so I really dislike that part of the front end development. Is I cannot make anything look pretty or function well. Like, I need assistance there. But I can make the application work, and then that's where somebody can take it off and it gets more finesse. I don't have a preference. I like to solve problems. And that's the way I frame it. You got a problem, I like to solve it. If I can use code, then I am the person that's going to do it, and I will do it in whatever language or whatever stack is needed so we can meet the goals. That's how I like to think of it. And I was always tentative to say full stack engineer, because when I think of full stack, that's a JavaScript developer, right? You're writing JavaScript in the front end, and then you're writing JavaScript via Node.js in the back end. That's a full stack. But I realize it's okay to say you're a full stack engineer if you're not writing the same language front to back, but you know how to manage the servers, or you know how to take it from pushing code to the continuous integration, continuous deployment, to the servers it's continuously deployed to the front end that reads the back end data. So I'm starting to say that I'm a full stack architect or like back end engineer. Also just saying front end, like, I know CSS, I can do things, but I don't make things look pretty very well. Thanks to Tailwind, it's a lot easier because it makes prototyping, but I'm not Mike Herschel. I can't do all the CSS wizardry that there is. All right, next one. So what wisdom will you share with developers whose careers are 4 years behind you? What would you have done differently? I think the one part is, 4 years behind me is, don't be afraid to make mistakes. And if you're at an organization that you're worried to make mistakes about, guess what? That organization sucks. And you should be thankful if they do fire you for making a mistake. Because they're not good enough for you. Obviously, it's really easy to say. It's harder to do, especially when it is your money. Like, right, that job is how you put food on your table. So it is easier said than done. But it's one of, like, think back to GitLab. When I was always like afraid of making mistakes because, what if, always the what ifs. What was it, like GitLab, somebody deleted the production database and the person wasn't reprimanded. The question was, could we let somebody do that? So someone who's 4 years behind me, like, try to find an organization that has that mentality. That's like, it's okay to screw up, because if you screw it up, we're missing a process somewhere. Like, how are you allowed to do it? Now, unless you were like really, like, did something really bad, but you should make sure you're at an organization that values you to make mistakes and say, like, well, I want to try it this way. And they let you try to do that. That can be very hard to find. That can be a very privileged thing, but that's something you should shoot for, in my opinion. Anyone 4 years behind, I feel like I got the most valuable things out of my career by just being involved in open source in the communities and getting to work on interesting problems and learn from interesting people. If you can go to conferences, do it. I remember my first Drupal conference very vividly. I got flown down to Drupal Camp Atlanta, and that's when, like, weather.com was being done, and I heard people talking about weather.com and the architecture. And, like, what? They're talking about this, they're sharing this, like, they're they weren't sharing like the details, but they're discussing things. And that just empowered me to say, like, oh, somebody said, like, oh, I can't figure this out. It's like, great, these people that know so much more and working on cooler projects, they don't know everything. So realize that too. What is imposter syndrome? I get imposter syndrome every day. There's tons of stuff that I don't know that people are better at. And I'm just like, what am I doing? Why do I bother doing it? Guess what? We all think that because we're all humans and we all have self-esteem issues here and there. So don't let that get you down. Don't worry about, like, oh, well, somebody's making more money. And it's like, man, I've seen things where people getting out of code boot camps and making 180 grand a year. They make more than me. They make like 60 grand more than me. And they're new. And I'm in the wrong field because I've been doing this for however long and not making that much money and not all that. So don't worry about other people. Just worry about you. It's probably the biggest part. learning code is just you. To get better at code, you just have to have the interesting problems put in front of you. So seek challenging problems. Take risks. Try to take projects that you can't deliver responsibly. Take projects you can't deliver responsibly so you can push yourself. Try to find ways to push yourself and push the envelope to gain confidence. And by doing that, you learn more things along the way. All right. Thoughts on CK Editor 5? I have no idea. I know there is a Drupal core patch to get CK Editor 5 into Drupal 10. I have not played with it, but it looks like it's really cool. It looks like it has the mod. CK Editor 4 was modern, but it wasn't modern for long. But it looks like CK Editor 5 is like the current editor experience we're seeing across like Confluence, Notion, Evernote is kind of there, but this more rich editor that's less about the toolbar and more just about the current space you're in. So I thought about demoing that patch on a live stream one day to investigate it. Or not investigate it, but to try it out. So I'm going to make sure I do that. Have I ever done a hackathon? No, I haven't. I mean, I've gone to sprints, but I've never done a hackathon. There was a thing in Minneapolis where it was a 24-hour hackathon to build a site for a nonprofit, and I wanted to do it, but I couldn't make it. I've always wanted to do one. It seems like it'd be fun. Just get in a room, like be in a room with a bunch of people working on a common goal. I don't consider any of the sprints I've done at DrupalCons or camps like a hackathon because they're always very specific in scope. And it was always on commerce, and there's people like, hey, can I help out? I'm like, I don't know. I don't even know how to solve this problem. How can I help you solve it? Was always a problem. It was never really prepared in that sense. When just generally organizing to fix like random bugs and not a specific project as a whole. So I've always wanted to do a hackathon, but I just have not ever had the chance to, which is kind of a bummer. Maybe I'm sure some people like it's not worth it, but it's one of those things that would be neat to experience when you're in a room with a bunch of people working on one thing and you're just sipping coffee and going nuts for like 10 hours. Next, what is your take on Travis CI versus Circle CI versus Tugboat? If you had to choose, what feature makes you lean towards one? So Travis CI I've only used because it was free for open source as de facto. I didn't like it, but it was what was available. I was always a big fan of Circle CI because it had pipelines, and they call them orbs and reusable commands. So Circle CI was always my go-to. I still use it on several projects, but GitHub Actions is kind of like eating everything. Although Circle CI is still better because you can have reusable commands that you set up inside your same file, where GitHub you have to write all these custom actions. Tugboat doesn't fit into that category because it's not a CI environment. It doesn't do your deployments. It's a preview environment. So Tugboat I highly recommend. Before, when it came to hosting, I only used platform.sh. Wouldn't use Acquia or Pantheon. It was platform.sh all the time because it gave you preview environments. So if I make a branch, you preview, I believe in deploying 10 times a day. If you're not deploying whenever you need to, then you're not delivering software. You need to build confidence in your code, and platform.sh allowed me to do that with the preview environments. Because I could test it. We could, have our automated test it, have the client approve it, boom, ship it once they sign off on it. Tugboat has allowed me to just use regular hosting now because it's my preview environment. I have a client that uses a Laravel app. We're hosted on AWS, EC2, and we have Tugboat environments. So whenever we have a pull request, test pass, give them preview environments. I'm like, does it look good? Like, looks good. Merge it, deploy it, done. And we use GitHub Actions for all the CI there and the deployments to deploy to EC2 and whatnot. So for continuous integration environments, use what's easiest. If you're on Bitbucket, use Bitbucket Pipelines because it's built in. Or use Circle CI. GitHub Actions is pretty good, but if you want to keep it like separated, the pipelines feature in Circle CI is way better. I would say it's comparable to GitLab. So GitLab and Circle CI I would say are like somewhat comparable. GitHub Actions is nowhere near like either of those two, but it just works and it's right there. I've never used Azure Pipelines, but I'm assuming Azure Pipelines has to be pretty similar to GitHub Actions since they're all owned by Microsoft. And I don't know of anything else like Tugboat for preview builds, but it's pretty amazing. And I use it on all of my projects, so that way I have preview environments. And I'm willing to hear about, like, if anybody's watching this or the recording, like if you have ones, like, let me know. I'm always curious to look into things. Next one, custom module versus patching. Which point does one transition? So with Drupal 8 and Drupal 9, I have moved away from patching as much as I can because we have object-oriented programming and service containers. So if a module isn't doing what I want it to, I first see, and before the module was like in Drupal, there's a hook for that. Now I'm like, can I swap that? So for instance, we had one. What's a good example? Like plugins. Let's say that the block module, like one of the blocks, isn't doing what you need it to. You could patch the project, or you could just override. You could swap the class. So you could tell Drupal, like, hey, this plugin actually uses my class. Override the one method and customize it, and then you don't have to patch it. What I'll usually do then still is I'll create the issue and I'll create the patch for the I'll create the patch for that project, but in my code I will override it on I will override I'll do the class override and document it with the link to the Drupal.org issue. So that way I don't have to manage any patches or worry about patches becoming stale or broken, but instead it just overrides. If my patch got committed, I can then like set up I always recommend do like a monthly, like end of month, end of sprint patch cleanup, like audit your patches. Did they get committed? Do you have releases that they're in? Nudge the maintainers to see if they can get a release out if it's been merged but not released. So also with the custom module, with Drupal 7, I know people create a lot of custom modules. My sites have like 2 custom modules. They're very monolithic because most of the code's in namespaces. So it's not like having a .module file that's 3,000 lines long. You have a bunch of different classes and files and namespaces. So I try to leverage the benefits of object-oriented programming by swapping classes, decorating services. And if none of this means anything to you, hit up a search engine and be like, Drupal service container, decorate services, how to replace an entity class, even forms. So I'll do that a handful of times. Like I've replaced the user edit form. Instead of writing hook form alter, I usually just swap out the form for my own because I don't like writing hooks anymore. I feel like hooks are hard to document. Where now if you have source form, that's there. And the .module file is just merely saying, instead of the .module file having all these hook forms that you have to read the logic of, you can say swaps this form. Here's why we're swapping the form. So at what point does one transition? Sometimes you can't, like sometimes swapping the class, you can't fix that logic, so you just patch it. And then that's the way it is. But if it's one that you can just easily override it by swapping it, I recommend that because I find that easier to maintain than having patches that might fail. Or I've had it where we had to patch something so many times, nothing applied, which I know sounds ridiculous. But when building Drupal Commerce, that was often the case, is we would have something that needs to be fixed in Commerce in a client site, but we haven't had a chance to like make it Contrib ready yet or go through the vetting process. So we had to, we would post all the patches, but then we just overrode everything via swapping. And then that end of month say like, oh yeah, okay, this patch for this client needs to get committed. Let's go do that in the issue queue. So find the balance that you can. Depends on your team too. Maybe managing patches is easier for your team than overriding things and keeping tabs on all of that. It just kind of depends. Question in the chat. Insights on truncating a Drupal DB for Tugboat or Platform.sh. So for platform.sh, you wouldn't truncate your DB because when you make a new branch and environment, it will clone the database. And for Tugboat, what we have is we set up a GitHub action that's on a cron, which you can set up cron. You can set most CI products. You can set up a cron job, and that goes and creates a database dump from our RDS instance. It runs a script to sanitize all the emails, and then runs it. Then it gzips it and uploads it to S3, and Tugboat will download that S3 file. So in Tugboat, usually you have like your database service, and in the init section, you'd like fetch a database dump. So we have a job that just pushes it to that, creates a dump, sanitizes it, gzips it, and uploads it to S3 and replaces the previous version. And then Tugboat every night does a rebuild, a refresh, so it ends up downloading that fresh instance. And actually, where would be a good example is probably on Acquia. I know Acquia, they have their Cloud Factory hooks or whatever they're called, and they have examples of using like Drush SQL Sanitize. So maybe to go in on a search index and like Acquia Sanitized Database, something like that. You know, when you do I believe when you do Drush SQL Dump, you can exclude, you can have certain tables have no data. Like you don't need cache data, you don't need Watchdog. So maybe it's things in there. I don't know off the top of my head, because for platform we just kind of like let the environment get cloned over. But there's lots of examples of that on the internet, I know. All right, we got about 15 minutes left. I'm gonna try to get through a few more. My little counter says that there are 24 questions remaining. This next one, could you share your approach from transforming a static call to config factory to dependency injection? Sometimes they don't have the same name. What would you do? So this relates to, let's go to git.drupal.org, and I'm not sharing my desktop, so let's go back to my desktop. So this refers to, and it's not composer, inside core lib Drupal. So in Drupal, we have this static class that allows easily accessing some services. If you're in Laravel, think of it like as a facade to be able to just access things from a global class without dependency injection. So if it doesn't have the one-to-one mapping, you can come in here and find the service key. So anything that has a shortcut in here is actually just a call to static git container git. So like we even have config, which is a call to the config factory to get a config. Q. So anything that you do the Drupal static class and call a method on, you can go to the source inside core lib drupal.php and see how it's calling it, and then do your own dependency injection to be able to have it in your own module. All right. What keeps you up at night? How to sustain that level, thrive, innovation, and commitment? I don't know. So nothing really keeps me up at night. Like I said before, I've stopped hacking on things at night. Maybe some pet projects, just because there's stuff I want to learn. Like a little itch. Like could read a book or could hack on some code. Do read. I encourage reading. I read too, but sometimes I just want to tinker and flex my brain. How do I stay in the level of drive, innovation, commitment, and thrive on it? I don't know. I ask myself that. I have no idea. I think it's because I know it's bigger than me, and I like that approach to it, where the work I do impacts others, and sometimes I can be upset that I know there's big agencies that are profiting off of the open source work and maybe not sponsoring other developers. Hopefully they're paying their developers good. I'll be happy with that's the case. If they pay their developers good, fine. But I know that code is helping somebody who is starting their own business and doing something for their own community. So that's what keeps me motivated to do it, because if it helps somebody do their own thing and empower them, then it's worth it. It's a pretty simple answer there, I think. It's just as long as it helps somebody else. This ties into the hackathon thing. Do I ever join hackathons with others? Haven't really been to one. Sprints, like the sprints at the conferences, were usually solo because it's hard problems, and I never really had time to plan them out. It was like, I'm at a conference, I don't have work, I'm not at home, I've got 3 hours to just crank through as much stuff as I can. So it was solo. Hackathons or planathons. I've done a few planathons where it's basically like no writing code, but you're just brainstorming as a group and coming up with what you will do. Those are pretty fun and useful. Or there's just no computers allowed. Get out sticky notes, write stuff on sticky notes, slap it up on the wall, and you're just planning instead of doing. Is a really good thought exercise as well. How to hire talented developers, what to look for, what to avoid. So for me, I don't. I made that up because people are like, oh, your GitHub profile is your resume. It's like, no, it's not. Anybody can go on GitHub and just throw some stuff together. What I've done before is, it's been a long time since I've had to do anything like this, but it's usually like a really somewhat simple task that requires them to go on the internet and figure out how to do it. When I was at the marketing agency, we had, for WordPress, we had our own base theme. And I was like, create a custom theme using this as a base theme. And I had one person that like took 2 hours and they didn't do it. I'm like, you couldn't go on the internet and search for it? They're just like clicking around, trying out code. And I was like, if you would have gone on the internet, the docs would have told you in 10 minutes. So that's what I look for, is like, can you solve problems? That's the main thing. Anybody can learn the code. Anybody can learn how to write language in a certain code, but can they solve problems? That's what you want to look for in a developer, because if you have somebody who can write great code off of a blueprint, well, what happens when the blueprint's wrong? And they know when to stop and say, hey, this isn't right. Example, I have a blog post in progress about it. But it's been together a playhouse that we got for our youngest's birthday. And the instructions didn't say how to, it had a washer that you're supposed to hammer into, or a nut that you're supposed to hammer into the wood, but nowhere did it say that. And I was just staring at it. I'm like, well, what do I do here? It didn't say I needed a wrench to screw this part in. And I was like, this kind of relates to like, what is a senior developer versus a junior developer? A junior developer might have just kept going instead of stopping to think, or might have just abandoned it and gone and like called somebody for help. But it's like, do they know how to just stop and figure out like, what's the alternative solution? The instructions don't make sense. They're missing this. How do they solve that problem? What is their thought process? That's what I look for when hiring talent or working with talent. To avoid people who are cocky, for sure, because you don't need that. You need humble people. You need people that are fun. You don't need somebody who thinks they're the top dog in the world. Just look for fun people that know how to learn and don't get too upset. Or if they do get upset at things when they fail, like, find ways to like grow them. Are they people that are willing to grow under your mentorship or your work? Those are hard to find, or that's hard to know, but those are things to keep in mind, especially as it's going. Did Acquia ever try to hire you? If so, what kept you different? No, I've never gotten a job offer from Acquia, although I get recruiters that hit me in my inbox nonstop for random companies. But I don't like going through recruiters because they don't know. Half the time the recruiter doesn't know anything about tech. They're just, when a recruiter comes to me and says, your LinkedIn profile looks great, what's your experience with Drupal? I'm like, did you go on Google at least, or like search my name? Like, I don't want to toot my own horn, but if you were to type in Matt Glomman and Drupal, you would know. Like, you would know something at least. So no, haven't. What kept me independent? I wasn't independent. I was at Centauro for a long time, and what made me want to do my own job is, one, I honestly was mindful of the Drupal community I didn't know what it would look like if I went to another company and what people would think of with Drupal commerce. But also I wanted to own my own destiny a bit. With my current job with Bluehorn Digital, my company, I've been able to help somebody transition to a new job. They want to become a developer. I was able to hire them to grow their development skills, and now they work at Cellar Door. So I was able to change their life. Now they work from home and they can do fun stuff with their family. So that was the main thing, is I wanted to be independent so I could kind of own my destiny in that bit. And there's this theme of, helping and growing others and making the impact. I wanted to keep doing that. In Kenosha, there's not much of a developer scene. Maybe if you go to Milwaukee, there's some, because we have the Milwaukee School of Engineering, but that's like, I know a few people that got hired off at like the big like military contractors out of that, or Rockwell Automation, where they're doing like hardware programming. And like in that scene, there's a lot of like .NET developers. Otherwise, you got to go down to Chicago to the Loop, and I'm not going to drive my car to Chicago and back every day like a lot of people do. There's a lot of people in Kenosha that drive to Chicago, and that is nuts. That is 4 hours of your day driving on top of an 8-hour or 9-hour workday. No way. So I did Bluehorn Digital to stay independent, so that way I can try to start something here as a development firm. We have marketing agencies that do websites. And they are talented. They are good. I mean, that's how I got my start here. But there's only so many of them, and they can only hire so many people. So why not? The opportunity that I was given, delivering beer, they had a job opening at the marketing company. I went for it. I want to recreate that as many times as I can, because the best thing we have going in Kenosha right now is there's a Uline factory and Amazon. That's not something to look forward to, in my opinion. Yes, they're decent jobs that pay about $18 an hour, but I think there can be better for more people. How do you handle RSS feeds on Drupal? The core aggregator module does not include images and other alternatives. Migrate API can do it, but that does not scale to editor friendly. So I'm assuming this means to embed RSS feeds in your Drupal site. Because with views, so that's another thing. Views, I may not use it, but if it's setting up an RSS feed, you bet I use it, because I'm not going to handwrite an RSS feed output. It's not skills, not editor friendly. So to import, aggregate the core aggregator module. Actually, I think it's going to be spun out in Drupal 10 to Contrib, is a way of pulling in RSS feeds as custom content. And yeah, it's not customizable. It's really bare bones. I think it got added in whatever version of Drupal and kind of just sat, and it got ported to Drupal 8 verbatim pretty much without improvement. The migrate API would definitely be overkill for this, to import data from a remote RSS feed. I think the feeds module has really come to fruition in the past year or two. So I would use the feeds module probably if I needed to import an RSS feed and add customization. So that's the feeds module. I would probably use that because it does have a user interface that's not too complicated. Like a site administrator should be able to figure it out. All right. Biggest issues seen on D8, D9 custom code and how to do better about them. Just there's a lot. I'm going to answer the second half of it. How to do better about them. Have a senior review your code. If you're in a project, don't let juniors or mid-level developers only write the code without oversight. Shoot, your seniors should have their code reviewed by the juniors. And so anybody writing code needs a code review. The juniors and mid-level developers should be reviewed by a senior developer to catch any gotchas. That's where the higher up you move as a developer, the less code you write, because you're doing more code review and direction, which is just the way it goes. But seniors should also have their code reviewed by the juniors and mids, so that way the juniors and mids learn, but they're going to catch things the senior missed because they're handling a lot more things. So that's how you can do better. The biggest issues in custom code I've seen is rendering things early instead of just, in Drupal 7, you'd have to call render a lot of times. You couldn't just pass render arrays the whole way down and it would work. That's different in Drupal 8. So people calling like Drupal render randomly inside the code, just arrays. You don't need to pre-render it. Render in an array, because actually in Drupal, if you call render and an attachment gets added, it could throw an exception because it can't catch the cacheable metadata. People writing code outside of hooks, like they're in the .module file and they're accessing the Drupal container. It's like, don't do it unless it's inside a function. Just not anything specific than D7. It's just like looking at it, like, what? Why? Somebody did something, they solved the problem, but they didn't have any reflection or oversight, I think. And that's code that's a problem in D7 and WordPress, Laravel, JavaScript. It doesn't matter what. It's, you had a problem, you fixed it, and no one else stopped to say, are you sure about this? Those are usually the biggest problems. And that's what can happen when you have more review. I'm sure I'm sure once I'm done, I'll think of a whole bunch more, but that's the big one. It's just lack of oversight and people saying like, are you sure this was a good idea? Which is hard when you have time crunch. I mean, I've been there. I wrote really crappy code because there was no time, and it's like, we'll get back to it, and you never get back to it. It's just, yeah, I can't think of it off the top of my head. And honestly, some of the biggest issues is just like logic checks being inefficient. Probably just try to find ways to make your logic checks more efficient, so that way there's more performance gains, because they could be organized to prevent unnecessary execution of code. Those are usually probably the biggest things I've ever seen in any code review. Is just the code needs to be restructured a little bit to make it more performant. All right, we're coming up on 2 hours. I'm going to try to do one more. Hopefully it's not okay. I'm going to close out with this one. If I have an M1 Mac, this is an M1 Mac, but it is not my primary machine. I received this from a client and I was using it. But my current machine is an Intel whatever it is. Let me see. i7. With the M1, I didn't have any. I had some issues at first. I stopped. I was using it back in like March. There's no Docker, but I had PHP set up with Homebrew and Apache and all that just fine. I know I have a friend, the one who's not Cellar Door. They were using Lando and Docker and having some issues, but that's because the MySQL image doesn't work on ARM architecture yet. But the MariaDB one does. So I guess I haven't had. I know folks who are using it and they don't have any difficulties. Like they're writing in Rust and Golang. So things are working out pretty well for them. I know I wasn't going to get one until I'm guessing M2 they're going to call it comes out, because I figure like let the first generation go by and see what happens and then get the M2. But didn't Apple just have their event and there was no M2 announcement? So maybe like next year. But it's really promising where it's going, and it is faster. I will say that it is faster, and the battery is 10 times better than anything on my whatever this is, i7. So, all right, thanks for tuning in. This was fun. I will probably do another one of these maybe once a month. I'll do like an AMA. But thanks for tuning in, and I'm glad you spent your Friday with me, and have a good weekend. Bye.